Welcome, deeply curious minds, to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into, well, one of the most fundamental, kind of mind-bending questions, really, about our very existence.
It absolutely is. It's something people have puzzled over forever.
What exactly is the relationship between that physical organ, the brain, and that invisible abstract realm we experience as the mind? I mean, think about it. Your joys, your sorrows, your memories, your deepest ambitions, that undeniable sense of you. Where does it all come from? How does it all work?
Yeah, how does the physical stuff give rise to,
Yeah.
well, us?
Our mission today is to pull back the curtain on this astonishing complexity. We're going to delve into the very core of what makes you, sifting through insights from centuries of philosophical debate and cutting-edge scientific exploration.
It's quite a journey, weaving together philosophy and neuroscience.
It really is. It's a journey that reveals how even the smallest neural connections contribute to your grand symphony of consciousness. And as always, I'm excited to explore this incredible material with our expert. Let's unpack this.
It's a profound honor to journey into this ancient question with you and with our listener. For millennia, people have wrestled with this mind-body problem, trying to understand how our thoughts and feelings connect to our physical form.
Right.
If we rewind to the 17th century, a pivotal figure who truly shaped this conversation was René Descartes. His ideas about the mind and body became incredibly influential and, surprisingly, still resonate with many people today.
Descartes is indeed often the starting point. He championed a concept known as dualism. For someone unfamiliar with it, what did Descartes mean by this, and what were his main arguments for separating mind and body?
Well, Descartes' dualism proposed that the immaterial mind, or soul, is entirely separate from the physical body, completely distinct stuff, despite our common experience of them as, unified.
So two separate things somehow interacting.
Exactly. He viewed the human body, in many ways, as a sophisticated machine. He'd actually seen these elaborate hydraulic robots in the French royal gardens.
Oh, right. I've heard about those.
Yeah, they responded reflexively to water pressure, performing complex automatic actions. He recognized that physical mechanisms could do quite a bit.
Okay, so bodies can be machine-like.
But, he argued, human capabilities went beyond this. Our ability to use language creatively, spontaneously, with genuine choice, that seemed impossible for a mere physical machine to him.
Ah, so the flexibility, the novelty of human thought and language.
Precisely. Our actions, he reasoned, transcended simple mechanical responses. That suggested something non-physical. An immaterial mind or soul was directing the machine. That was his first major argument.
So he looked at these early robots and thought, bodies might be like that, but there's something else, something more inside us driving the show. What was his second, and perhaps even more famous, argument for this separation?
Ah, yes. His second argument is the renowned method of doubt. This is where Descartes really tried to find bedrock certainty. He systematically questioned everything he believed.
Everything.
Everything. Could he truly be sure of the physical world? Or even his own body? He considered scenarios like maybe he was dreaming, or perhaps even being deceived by some powerful evil demon, sort of precursor to the Matrix idea.
Right, questioning the very nature of reality.
Exactly. But through all this doubt, he found one thing he absolutely could not doubt. The very act of thinking itself. The fact that he was doubting proved he was thinking.
Then thinking proved existence.
Correct. The act of thinking proved he existed as a thinking thing. This led directly to his famous conclusion, Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am.
Okay, I exist as a thinking thing. How does that separate mind from body?
Well, the implication he drew was profound. If he could doubt the existence of his physical body, maybe it was an illusion created by the demon, but he couldn't doubt the existence of his thinking mind, then the mind must be fundamentally different, distinct from the body.
Because one could be doubted, the other couldn't.
Precisely. He concluded the thinking soul or mind must exist independently of any material thing.
That's a powerful argument, and it feels, well, deeply intuitive somehow. And it explains why so many of us, even today, kind of resonate with the sort of common sense dualism. We talk about my brain or my body, right?
Absolutely. That language implies ownership over something separate from the I that's doing the owning.
And our intuitions about personal identity often reflect this too, don't they? Like in stories or thought experiments.
Oh, completely. Common sense dualism is woven into our everyday understanding and our fiction. Think about how easily we grasp scenarios where someone wakes up in a different body, like in some movies, or even a classic like Kafka's Metamorphosis.
Where Groger Samsa becomes an insect.
But he's still him, right?
Yeah.
The thinking, feeling Gregor is trapped inside this insect body. Homer, centuries before, told of Odysseus's men turned into pigs by Circe, but they retained their human minds, weeping inside those pig bodies.
Wow, that's a powerful image.
These stories resonate because our gut feeling, our intuition, is often that we, our conscious self, are separate from the physical form we inhabit. This dualist intuition also underlies widespread beliefs in an immaterial soul surviving after bodily death. Concepts like heaven, spirit worlds, it all taps into this deeply ingrained viewpoint.
It's incredible how pervasive that perspective is, culturally and intuitively. But modern science, as you've hinted, has developed a very different take on this relationship. We seem to be moving from these philosophical doubts towards, well, what some call an astonishing hypothesis.
Indeed. While dualism has that strong intuitive pull, the scientific consensus today largely rejects it. Francis Crick, the Nobel laureate famous for co-discovering DNA structure, he famously articulated what he called the astonishing hypothesis.
Okay, what was so astonishing about it?
Crick proposed, quite bluntly, that you, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules.
Wow, that's quite a statement.
It is. In essence, the modern scientific viewpoint is that the mind is what the brain does. All our mental life, consciousness, emotions, choices, that sense of you, are products of the brain's physical activities. Not something separate interacting with it, but the activity itself.
That's a huge departure from Descartes. So what are the most compelling scientific arguments against dualism, the ones that lead us to this astonishing hypothesis?
There are several powerful lines of reasoning. Firstly, from a scientific standpoint, dualism has a fundamental problem. It's inherently unscientific because it fails to provide testable explanations.
How so?
Well, it doesn't explain how an immaterial entity, something non-physical like a soul, could possibly interact with physical matter like the brain or body. This is often called the interaction problem or connection problem.
Right. How does a ghost push a button?
Exactly. How does a non-physical thought cause physical neurons to fire and make your hand move? Or, conversely, how does a physical substance like alcohol or caffeine affect the reasoning or mood of an immaterial mind? Science needs mechanisms, pathways, things it can actually study and potentially measure. Dualism doesn't offer that.
Okay, so it's hard to test scientifically. What else?
Secondly, Descartes' original premise that physical objects couldn't possibly perform complicated, flexible tasks like human thought. Well, that premise has been definitively challenged, especially by modern technology.
You mean like computers and AI?
Precisely. His 17th century hydraulic robots were pretty limited, let's be honest. But today, we have sophisticated artificial intelligence systems that can play chess at a grandmaster level, manipulate symbols, process language, perform complex logical reasoning.
So physical systems can do incredibly complex things.
Yes. This provides an existence proof. It demonstrates that complex physical systems are capable of incredibly intricate processing, opening the door to understanding humans not as ghosts and machines, but as incredibly sophisticated biological machines themselves.
Makes sense. And the third argument, you mentioned brain imaging.
Yes, and perhaps this is the most compelling line of evidence: the overwhelming and direct link between brain activity and mental life. This isn't entirely new, of course. People have known for centuries that, say, a hard knock on the head can change someone's personality or abilities.
Or diseases affecting the mind.
Right. Diseases like syphilis were known to cause mental derangement. And we all know how chemicals like caffeine or alcohol affect our thoughts and feelings. But modern neuroscience, with tools like CAT scans, PE scans, and especially fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, lets us actually see the brain in action while people are thinking, feeling, perceiving.
What do these scans show?
They show incredibly specific correlations. Different brain regions become more active during specific mental tasks. When you're looking at words, certain visual areas light up. When you're hearing words, auditory areas become active. Reading activates another set. Even generating words involves distinct motor planning areas.
So different thoughts, different brain activity patterns.
Exactly. And what's truly remarkable is that researchers are getting better at decoding these patterns. They can sometimes infer, just by looking at the fMRI data, whether someone is thinking about, say, music versus faces or making a moral judgment versus solving a math problem. Sometimes even which specific object they might be imagining.
That's incredible.
It really is. This profound and detailed correlation strongly argues that our mental life isn't just associated with brain activity. It is the brain activity. The mind is what the brain does.
Okay, so if our mind truly is what our brain does, then we absolutely need to understand the fundamental machinery behind it all. Let's zoom right in then to the individual actor in this grand play, the neuron. How do these tiny units actually function?
The neuron is the core component, the brain's fundamental processing unit. Think of it as a tiny biological switch, but when you connect billions of them together, you get the basis for incredibly complex thought.
And the scale is just mind-boggling, right?
Oh, absolutely staggering. The human brain contains roughly 100 billion neurons. It's billion with a B. And each one of those neurons can connect with thousands of others.
So the number of connections is astronomical.
It is. We're talking something like 100 trillion connection points or synapses. It is by far the most complex and densely interconnected computing machine known to exist, all packed into, the space between your ears.
Amazing. So how does a single neuron work? What are its parts?
Well, a typical neuron has sort of three main parts for communication. It has input branches called dendrites, which act like antennas receiving signals from other neurons. Then there's the cell body, which contains the nucleus and basically integrates all those incoming signals, adds them up, if you will.
The decision center.
Kind of, yeah. And if the sum of those signals reaches a certain threshold, then the third part, the axon, sends an output signal down its length. The axon is like a transmission cable, often very long, carrying the message to other neurons, or sometimes muscles or glands.
Okay, dendrites receive, cell body integrates, axon sends. How does it send the signal? Is it like electricity in a wire?
It is electrical, but it's more complex than simple current flow. Neurons communicate by firing these all-or-none impulses called action potentials.
All or none. What does that mean?
It means the neuron either fires or it doesn't. There's no halfway. And if it does fire, the signal it sends down the axon is always the same strength, the same size. Think of it like firing a gun. Either it fires completely or it doesn't fire at all. You can't fire a gun a little bit.
Okay. But that seems weird, right? Because sensations feel stronger or weaker. A dim light versus a bright light, a gentle touch versus a hard push. How does an all-or-none system signal intensity?
That's a fantastic question. It seems counterintuitive, doesn't it? Since the strength of a single action potential doesn't change, the brain encodes intensity in other ways.
How?
Primarily through two mechanisms. First, the rate of firing. A stronger stimulus will cause the neuron to fire action potentials more frequently. So instead of bang, 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 it's bang, 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 bang.
Oh, the frequency changes.
Exactly. And second, the number of neurons firing. A more intense stimulus will recruit more neurons to fire simultaneously. So more neurons firing and firing more often. That's how the brain represents intensity using these all-or-none signals.
Okay, rate and number, that makes sense. And this action potential, this bang, travels down the axon. Then what? How does it talk to the next neuron?
Right, so the action potential travels down the axon like a wave of electrical change. But when it reaches the very end of the axon, it doesn't physically jump across to the next neuron. There's a tiny, tiny gap there.
The synapse.
Precisely, the synapse. It's an incredibly small space. And communication across this gap is chemical, not electrical. Yes. When the action potential arrives at the axon terminal, it triggers the release of chemical messengers called neurotransmitters into that synaptic gap.
Okay.
These neurotransmitter molecules drift across the gap and bind to special receptor sites on the dendrites or cell body of the next neuron. You can think of it like a key fitting into a lock.
And what happens when the key fits the lock?
It causes a small electrical change in the receiving neuron. Depending on the specific neurotransmitter and receptor, this effect can be either excitatory, meaning it makes the receiving neuron slightly more likely to fire its own action potential.
Like hitting the gas pedal.
Exactly. Or it can be inhibitory, making the receiving neuron slightly less likely to fire.
Hitting the brake.
Perfect analogy. Common examples are glutamate, which is often excitatory, and GABA, which is usually inhibitory. And remember, each neuron is getting potentially thousands of these gas and brake signals simultaneously from all the neurons connecting to it.
So it's constantly doing this complex math.
Constantly. It's summing up all those excitatory and inhibitory inputs. If the gas signals outweigh the brake signals enough to reach that threshold we mentioned, then bang, it fires its own action potential. It's an ongoing, incredibly complex calculation.
That's just for the fast, immediate signaling. You mentioned longer-term changes, too.
Right. Those fast excitatory and inhibitory signals are crucial for rapid information processing. But there's another class of chemical signaling involving neuromodulators. These often work through slower second messenger systems inside the receiving cell.
And what do they do?
Instead of just quickly opening or closing ion channels like the fast neurotransmitters, neuromodulators trigger longer-lasting biochemical changes within the neuron. These changes can alter the neuron's excitability, its responsiveness to other signals, or even influence gene expression, affecting its structure or function over time.
So they're less like hitting the gas brake and more like tuning the engine.
That's a great way to put it. They modulate the overall state of neural circuits. They're heavily involved in regulating broader psychological states like sleep, arousal, mood, motivation, and emotion. Think of neurotransmitters like dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine. These often act as neuromodulators. And crucially, they play a vital role in the neural basis of learning and memory by strengthening or weakening synaptic connections over the longer term.
It's incredible how these chemical interactions underpin everything from a quick reflex to our deepest feelings and memories. And it makes perfect sense then how drugs, both medical and recreational, can have such profound effects by interfering with these very systems. How do drugs typically interact with neurotransmitters?
Fundamentally, drugs that affect the brain work by altering synaptic transmission. They generally act as either agonists or antagonists.
Antagonists, what's the difference?
An agonist is a drug that increases or mimics the effect of a particular neurotransmitter. It might do this by, say, stimulating the release of more neurotransmitter, or by binding to the receptor site and activating it just like the natural chemical would, or by blocking the reuptake of the neurotransmitter so it stays in the synapse longer.
Can you give some examples?
Sure. Amphetamines, for instance, act as agonists for norepinephrine and dopamine, boosting arousal and activity. That's the speedy feeling. Many antidepressants, like Prozac, are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs. They block the reuptake of serotonin, making more of it available in the synapse, which can help alleviate symptoms of depression. L-DOP, used to treat Parkinson's disease, is an agonist because it's a precursor molecule that the brain converts into dopamine, helping to replace the dopamine lost due to the disease.
Okay, so agonists boost the signal. What about antagonists?
Antagonists do the opposite. They decrease or block the effect of a neurotransmitter. They might work by blocking the release of the neurotransmitter, or more commonly, by binding to the receptor site without activating it, thereby preventing the natural neurotransmitter from binding and having its effect, like putting the wrong key in the lock so the right key can't get in.
Examples of those?
A classic example is Curare, the poison used on blow darts. It's an antagonist for acetylcholine at the neuromuscular junction, blocking muscle activation and causing paralysis. Certain antipsychotic drugs act as antagonists for dopamine receptors. And alcohol. Alcohol is interesting.
How so? It generally makes people feel less inhibited, right? More outgoing initially.
It does, which seems paradoxical for something that's ultimately a depressant. Alcohol primarily acts as an antagonist for glutamate, an excitatory transmitter, and an agonist for GABA, an inhibitory transmitter. Crucially, it seems to preferentially inhibit the inhibitory parts of the brain first, particularly in the frontal lobes, which are responsible for judgment and self-control.
Ah, so it inhibits the inhibition.
Exactly, leading to that initial feeling of disinhibition.
Yeah.
But take enough, and it starts inhibiting the excitatory pathways too, leading eventually to sedation, loss of coordination, and even unconsciousness. So by understanding these agonist and antagonist actions, we gain huge insights into both how to design medical treatments and how recreational drugs exert their effects.
So we have these billions of individual neurons, each acting like a tiny, complex decision maker, constantly integrating these chemical gas and brake signals across trillions of synapses. But the brain isn't just a random jumble of these cells, it's highly organized. And you mentioned earlier it's not really hardwired like a computer. What makes the brain's wiring so special, so different?
That's a critical point. The computer analogy is useful up to a point, but the brain possesses qualities that far surpass most human-made machines, particularly its incredible resistance to damage and its extraordinary speed in performing complex tasks like perception or language.
How is it more resistant to damage?
Well, think about your laptop. If you snip a crucial wire or damage a specific chip, it's often catastrophic. The whole system might fail. The brain, however, can often sustain significant localized damage, perhaps from a stroke or injury. Yet mental functioning can be remarkably preserved, or recovery can occur over time. This suggests a high degree of redundancy and flexibility, that different parts can, to some extent, take over functions, or that information isn't stored in just one tiny spot, it's much more distributed.
Okay, resilience. What about speed? You said neurons are actually quite slow compared to computer signals?
They are. Individually, nerve impulses travel much, much slower than electrical signals in copper wires. If the brain processed information purely sequentially, one step after another like a traditional computer program, tasks like recognizing a familiar face or understanding a spoken sentence would take minutes, maybe even hours.
But we do those things almost instantaneously.
The answer lies in parallel processing. The brain doesn't work like a single assembly line. Instead, it has countless neurons and circuits operating simultaneously, in parallel, working on different aspects of a problem at the same time.
Like having millions of tiny computers all working together.
Sort of, yes. It's massively parallel and distributed. When you see a face, different networks are processing the shape, the color, the features, maybe accessing memories associated with that face, all happening concurrently. This massive parallelism allows the brain, despite the slowness of its individual components, to achieve incredible computational power and speed, especially for complex pattern recognition tasks that current AI still struggles to match in terms of flexibility and nuance. It's a symphony of slow actors producing incredibly fast results.
That distributed parallel nature really changes the picture. So moving from the microscopic world of neurons and synapses to the larger scale, how are these countless cooperating neurons organized? How do they create everything from a simple reflex right up to conscious thought? Let's talk about the functional organization of the nervous system.
Right. The nervous system is organized hierarchically, with different levels handling different tasks. Broadly, you have the central nervous system, CNS, which is the brain and spinal cord, the command center, basically. And then you have the peripheral nervous system, PNS, which consists of the nerves extending out from the CNS to the rest of the body.
What do those peripheral nerves do?
They're the communication lines. Sensory neurons in the PNS carry information into the CNS from your sense organs, skin, muscles, and internal organs. Motor neurons carry messages out from the CNS to control muscles and glands.
And the motor system has different parts too, right?
Yes. There's the skeletal motor system, which controls the voluntary movements of your skeletal muscles, like deciding to pick up this pen. And then there's the autonomic motor system, which operates largely unconsciously, modulating activity in your visceral muscles and glands, things like heart rate, digestion, sweating, pupil dilation.
The automatic stuff.
Exactly. And the autonomic system itself is famously divided into two branches that often have opposing effects. There's the sympathetic division, which prepares the body for action, the fight or flight response.
So heart rate up, energy mobilized.
Right. Increased heart rate, release of energy stores, inhibited digestion, dilated pupils, getting you ready for exertion or stress. Then there's the parasympathetic division, which promotes calming, rest and digest functions.
Slowing things down, conserving energy.
Precisely. Slowed heart rate, increased digestion, energy conservation. These two systems work in balance to maintain the body's internal equilibrium.
Okay, that's the periphery. What about the central nervous system itself? Let's start with the spinal cord. Is it just a cable connecting brain and body?
It's much more than just a passive conduit, although that's one critical role, acting as a superhighway, carrying sensory information up to the brain and motor commands down from the brain. But the spinal cord is also capable of organizing some behaviors on its own, particularly simple reflexes.
Like pulling your hand away from something hot.
That's the classic example, the flexion reflex. If you touch something painfully hot or sharp, sensory neurons send a signal straight into the spinal cord. Within the spinal cord, interneurons connect this signal directly to motor neurons that cause your muscles to contract and pull your limb away.
And this happens before the signal even reaches the brain.
Yes. The withdrawal happens incredibly quickly because the circuit is contained within the spinal cord. The signal also travels up to your brain, which is why you consciously feel the pain and become aware of what happened, but the reflex action itself occurs fractionally earlier. It's a protective mechanism, providing a crucial speed advantage.
Wow. Can it do anything more complex than simple reflexes?
It can. The spinal cord also contains pattern generators, networks of neurons that produce basic rhythmic patterns of muscle activity needed for locomotion, like walking, running, or swimming.
Without the brain telling it each step.
The basic rhythm can be generated locally. Of course, the brain initiates, stops, and guides these movements, adjusting them to the terrain and your goals. But the underlying alternating pattern, left, right, can be produced by spinal cord circuits. The infamous headless chicken phenomenon, where a chicken can briefly run after decapitation, is a rather grim demonstration of these spinal pattern generators still functioning.
Okay, so the spinal cord is surprisingly capable. Moving up into the head, what about the structures below the big, wrinkly cortex? the subcortical structures.
Right. Beneath the large cerebral cortex lie older, more primitive parts of the brain, collectively known as subcortical structures. These handle many essential foundational functions. Closest to the spinal cord is the brainstem, which includes the medulla, pons, and midbrain.
What does the brainstem do?
Anatomically and functionally, it's somewhat like an extension of the spinal cord, but more complex. It contains nuclei that organize more complex reflexes than those in the spinal cord, like postural reflexes that help you maintain balance, and vital reflexes controlling breathing and heart rate. Damage here is often fatal for that reason.
So absolutely critical for basic survival.
Absolutely. The brainstem also plays a role in organizing species-typical movement patterns. More complex, coordinated actions common to a species, like those involved in eating, drinking, attacking, or copulating.
Instinctive behaviors.
Largely, yes. We can get a sense of its function by considering what happens if the brainstem is disconnected from higher brain areas. A brainstem animal, one with only a functioning brainstem, can still perform many of these basic behaviors if triggered by the right stimulus. It might walk if pushed, chew and swallow if food is placed in its mouth, arch its back if touched appropriately.
But it wouldn't initiate these actions.
Exactly. It lacks spontaneous goal-directed behavior. It acts more like, well, a complex machine that just responds automatically to certain triggers. It highlights how much our planning, motivation, and conscious control come from higher brain regions interacting with these basic structures.
Fascinating contrast. What other key players are down there?
Moving up from the brainstem, we find the thalamus. Think of it as a major sensory relay station. Almost all sensory information coming from your sense organs, except smell, interestingly, passes through the thalamus on its way to the cerebral cortex for higher-level processing. It also relays motor signals.
The grand central station of sensory input.
That's a good way to think about it. Then there are the cerebellum and the basal ganglia, both crucial for coordinating movement, but in slightly different ways.
Cerebellum. That's the little brain at the back?
Yes. The cerebellum is critical for producing rapid, well-timed sequences of movement. Think about pitching a baseball, playing a fast piece on the piano, or even just smoothly reaching for something. It uses sensory information in a feed-forward way to pre-program the movement before it starts, ensuring it unfolds smoothly and accurately without needing moment-to-moment correction. Damage here leads to jerky, uncoordinated movements.
And the basal ganglia.
The basal ganglia are more involved in slower, deliberate movements and adjusting movements as they happen. Think about smoothly getting up from a chair or maintaining posture while walking. They use sensory information more for feedback control, making ongoing adjustments based on how the movement is progressing. Parkinson's disease, which involves degeneration in the basal ganglia, famously affects this kind of movement control.
So cerebellum for fast, pre-programmed sequences, basal ganglia for slower, feedback-adjusted movements. Makes sense. What about emotions and memory?
For that, we look primarily to the limbic system, a set of interconnected structures located roughly around the border, the limbus, between the brainstem and the cerebral cortex. This system, including structures like the amygdala and the hippocampus, is fundamentally involved in regulating our basic drives, emotions, and the formation of certain types of memories.
The hippocampus is famous for memory, right?
Yes, particularly for encoding new explicit memories of facts and events, and also, interestingly, for spatial navigation and mapping our location in space. The amygdala is strongly linked to processing emotions, especially fear.
And there's one more really important small structure.
Indeed, the hypothalamus. It's tiny, located just below the thalamus, but it's vitally important. Its main job is to regulate the body's internal environment.
Like a thermostat.
Exactly like a central thermostat and control panel for the body. It influences the autonomic nervous system, controls the release of hormones via the pituitary gland, and regulates basic drive states like hunger, thirst, body temperature, and sleep-wake cycles. It also plays a central role in generating emotional states. It's the link between the brain and the body's internal systems.
It's truly astounding how many critical, often unconscious functions these subcortical structures manage, keeping us alive, moving, feeling, and functioning without us even having to think about it. But now, let's finally turn to what many consider the crown jewel of the human brain, the part responsible for our most complex, uniquely human abilities, the cerebral cortex.
The cerebral cortex really is the seat of our higher cognitive functions. It's the large outermost layer of the brain, and it's the most recent part to evolve. In humans, it's massive, making up about 80% of the brain's total volume.
And it has that famously wrinkled, folded appearance. Why?
Those folds and wrinkles aren't just for show. They dramatically increase the surface area of the cortex that can be packed inside the skull. If you were to flatten out the human cortex, it would cover a pretty large area, like a large pizza or a tablecloth. The folding allows all that neural real estate to fit.
More surface area means more processing power.
Essentially, yes. More room for neurons and their connections. The cortex is divided broadly into two halves, the left and right hemispheres, which are connected by that bundle of fibers we mentioned, the corpus callosum, and each hemisphere is further divided into four main lobes.
Okay, what are the four lobes and what do they generally do?
At the back, you have the occipital lobe, which is primarily dedicated to processing visual information. On the sides, roughly beneath your temples, are the temporal lobes, which are crucial for hearing, language comprehension, and aspects of memory and object recognition.
Above the temporal lobes.
That's the parietal lobe, located towards the top and back of the head. It's involved in processing bodily sensations, touch, temperature, pain, pressure, as well as spatial awareness, navigation, and integrating sensory information. And finally, at the very front, behind your forehead, is the largest lobe, the frontal lobe.
And that's the one involved in planning and complex thought.
Exactly. The very back part of the frontal lobe contains the primary motor cortex, which controls voluntary movements. But the rest of the frontal lobe, especially the prefrontal cortex right at the front, is heavily involved in executive functions. Planning, decision-making, working memory, personality expression, social behavior, and moderating actions. It's often considered the seat of our highest cognitive abilities.
Within these lobes, how is the cortex functionally organized?
We can categorize cortical areas into three main types. There are primary sensory areas, which are the receiving stations for signals from the sensory organs, like the primary visual cortex in the occipital lobe, primary auditory in the temporal, and primary somatosensory in the parietal. Then there's the primary motor area in the frontal lobe, which sends commands down to initiate fine-tuned voluntary movements.
And the third type?
The vast majority of the human cortex, much more than in, say, a rat, consists of association areas. These areas receive input from sensory areas in lower parts of the brain, and they're involved in the incredibly complex processes that we call perception, thought, and decision-making. They're where information from different senses is integrated, where memories are accessed, and where plans are formulated. The significant expansion of these association areas is really what distinguishes the human brain.
And you mentioned earlier this idea of topographic organization, maps in the brain.
Yes, a key principle, particularly for the primary sensory and motor areas, is topographic organization. This means that adjacent neurons in these cortical areas correspond to adjacent receptors on the skin or muscles in the body. It creates orderly maps.
Like a map of the body laid out on the surface of the brain.
Exactly. The neurosurgeon Wilder Penfield famously mapped these areas back in the mid-20th century. During brain surgery for epilepsy, often done with patients awake under local anesthesia, he would gently stimulate different points on the surface of the cortex with an electrode.
And what happened?
When he stimulated points in the somatosensory cortex, patients would report feeling sensations like tingling or numbness in specific parts of their body. When he stimulated the motor cortex, specific body parts would move. By doing this systematically, he created detailed maps of the motor and sensory cortices.
And these maps aren't proportional to body size, right?
Not at all. That's what's fascinating. The amount of cortical area devoted to a particular body part is proportional to its sensitivity or the fineness of motor control required, not its physical size. This leads to the famous distorted body map, often depicted as a grotesque figure called the homunculus.
With huge hands and lips.
Precisely. The homunculus has enormous hands, fingers, lips, and tongue because these areas are incredibly sensitive and require very fine motor control, so they get a large share of the cortical real estate. But the torso, arms, and legs, which are less sensitive and have coarser motor control, have a much smaller representation in the cortex.
A very vivid illustration of functional importance over physical size. Let's go back to the frontal lobe, the executive suite. How does it orchestrate our actions?
The frontal lobe plays a crucial role in planning and initiating voluntary actions. Areas just in front of the primary motor cortex, known as the premotor areas, are involved in setting up the specific movement programs or sequences needed to achieve a goal.
Choosing the right movements.
Yes. But the association areas further forward in the frontal lobe, the prefrontal cortex, are responsible for the higher-level planning. They integrate information from all other brain areas, sensory input, memories, emotional states, from the limbic system to set up general plans for action based on current goals and context.
So deciding what to do and why.
In large part, yes, and considering the potential consequences. Damage to these frontal association areas often doesn't impair basic perception or movement, but it severely disrupts the ability to use information effectively to guide behavior. People might struggle with initiating actions, shifting flexibly between tasks, inhibiting inappropriate responses, and especially with long-range planning and anticipating future needs. They can perceive everything perfectly well, but struggle to act on it strategically or appropriately.
It really underscores the complexity of even a simple voluntary action. Could you maybe walk us through how the whole system might work together for something concrete, like, say, reaching for some peanuts because you're hungry?
Yeah. Sure, that's a great example of the hierarchical control. It involves multiple levels of the brain working together in a top-down fashion.
Okay, step one.
Step one is motivation and high-level planning. Your limbic system, specifically the hypothalamus, signals hunger. Your association cortex, visual areas seeing the peanuts, memory areas recalling you like peanuts, frontal areas assessing if it's appropriate to take them now, generates the general goal.
Yep.
Get peanuts.
Okay, goal set. Then what?
Step two involves generating the specific motor program. This involves structures like the basal ganglia, cerebellum, and premotor areas in the cortex. They take the general goal and refine it based on sensory input. Where exactly are the peanuts? What's the position of my body? They select and sequence the necessary movements, maybe walking over, reaching out, grasping. The cerebellum ensures the timing and smoothness. The basal ganglia help initiate and control the ongoing movement.
So refining the plan into specific instructions.
Exactly. Step three is refining the components of that movement. Programs for larger postural adjustments or walking might be sent down to motor nuclei in the brainstem. Programs for the delicate movements of your fingers needed to shell the peanuts would be handled primarily by the motor cortex.
And finally, execution.
Step four is execution. Commands travel down from the motor cortex and brainstem via motor neurons in the lower brainstem and spinal cord. These activate the specific skeletal muscles in your torso, legs, arms, and fingers to produce the movements. Simultaneously, the autonomic nervous system might kick in, maybe activating salivary glands in anticipation of eating.
Wow. That's an incredible cascade of coordinated activity for something so simple.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it highlights that hierarchical flow from general goals down to specific muscle contractions.
Yeah.
But as you noted earlier, it also raises the deeper question. Knowing where all this happens in the limbic system, cortex, cerebellum, etc., doesn't fully explain how the brain actually performs these computations. How does it decide? How does it program the action? Those how questions are still major frontiers in neuroscience.
That's a crucial distinction. Mapping the where is just the beginning of understanding the how. Now, let's explore some of the brain's most compelling stories, things that reveal even more about its organization. We often think of the brain as symmetrical, left mirroring right, but particularly in the cerebral cortex, there are some really striking specializations between the two halves, right?
You're absolutely right. While many brain structures, especially lower down, appear largely symmetrical in function, the cerebral cortex exhibits significant hemispheric specialization or lateralization, particularly in those large association areas we talked about.
So the left and right sides do different things.
To a significant extent, yes. Although it's important to remember they are constantly communicating via that massive corpus callosum. For basic sensory and motor functions, the control is mostly contralateral.
Meaning opposite side.
Exactly. Information from the right visual field goes primarily to the left hemisphere's visual cortex. The left hemisphere controls movements on the right side of the body, and vice versa. That part is largely symmetrical.
But the asymmetry comes in with higher functions.
Yes, particularly in the association areas. The most famous example is language. In the vast majority of people, over 95% of right-handers and even a majority of left-handers, the left hemisphere is dominant for processing language. This includes both producing fluent, grammatically correct speech and understanding complex language. It also seems more involved in logical reasoning and analytical tasks.
So the left is the analytical language hemisphere for most people. What about the right?
The right hemisphere, conversely, seems specialized for nonverbal visuospatial analysis. Tasks like recognizing faces, interpreting emotional expressions, reading maps, appreciating music, drawing geometric shapes, or judging distances and orientations in space, these tend to rely more heavily on the right hemisphere. It's more holistic and pattern-oriented.
Left brain, right brain. That's a popular idea, but sometimes oversimplified, right?
Very much so. While these specializations are real and demonstrable, the idea of people being purely left-brained or right-brained thinkers is a vast oversimplification. Both hemispheres are constantly working together, sharing information across the corpus callosum for almost everything we do. But the specializations are fascinating, and some of the most dramatic insights into them came from studying patients who had that connection, severed the split brain studies.
Right, the work by Roger Sperry and Michael Gazzaniga, what did they find?
It was groundbreaking work, earning Sperry a Nobel Prize. These patients had their corpus callosum surgically cut, usually as a drastic measure to control severe, intractable epilepsy, preventing seizures from spreading between hemispheres. This effectively created two largely independent hemispheres within one skull. Researchers like Gazzaniga could then cleverly present information to just one hemisphere at a time.
How did they do that?
For vision, they'd flash a word or picture very briefly to one side of the patient's visual field, say, the left field, which projects only to the right hemisphere. For touch, they might place an object in one hand, which sends sensory info primarily to the opposite hemisphere, while the patient couldn't see it.
And what happened when they tested language?
The results were striking. If a word like key was flashed to the right visual field, going to the left, language-dominant hemisphere, the patient could easily read the word aloud. Key. But if the same word key was flashed to the left visual field, going to the nonverbal right hemisphere, the patient would typically report seeing nothing.
They couldn't say the word.
Correct.
Yeah.
The right hemisphere saw the word, but it couldn't access the speech mechanisms located in the left hemisphere. However, and this is the fascinating part, if you then ask the patient to reach under a screen with their left hand, controlled by the right hemisphere, and pick out the object they saw from a group of items.
They could pick out the key.
Yes. Their left hand would correctly identify and pick up the key, even while the patient was verbally insisting they hadn't seen anything. It vividly demonstrated that the right hemisphere could perceive and understand the word, but simply couldn't talk about it. Only the left hemisphere could generate speech in these patients.
That's truly mind-bending. What about the right hemisphere's spatial abilities?
Those studies confirmed the right hemisphere's superiority in visuospatial tasks. For example, split-brain patients were much better at arranging blocks to match a complex pattern, or drawing three-dimensional figures when using their left hand, controlled by the right hemisphere, compared to the right hand.
So the right hemisphere knew the spatial layout better. But Gazzaniga also developed this idea of the left hemisphere interpreter, right? What's that about?
Yes, this is one of Gazzaniga's most intriguing hypotheses based on later split-brain experiments. He noticed that the left hemisphere seemed driven to create explanations, to make sense of the world, even when it didn't have all the information.
It tries to create a coherent story.
Exactly. In one famous experiment, they simultaneously showed a picture of a chicken claw to the patient's left hemisphere, right visual field, and a picture of a snow scene to the right hemisphere, left visual field. The patient was then asked to point to related pictures from a selection in front of them.
What did they point to?
The right hand, controlled by the left hemisphere, which saw the claw, correctly pointed to a picture of a chicken. The left hand, controlled by the right hemisphere, which saw the snow scene, correctly pointed to a picture of a snow shovel. So far, so good. Each hemisphere responded appropriately to what it saw.
But then they asked why.
Yes. When the experimenter asked the patient why they pointed to those items, the verbal left hemisphere, which only knew about the chicken claw, not the snow scene, immediately confabulated an explanation. Oh, that's simple. The chicken claw goes with the chicken, and you need a shovel to clean out the chicken shed.
Wow. It just invented a plausible reason connecting the two actions.
Precisely. It created a narrative that made logical sense of the shovel, even though its real reason for being chosen, the snow scene, was inaccessible to the speaking left hemisphere. Gazzaniga proposed this interpreter function is a general characteristic of the left hemisphere. It constantly strives to interpret our actions, feelings, and the world around us, creating a running commentary, a personal narrative that makes sense of it all, even if that involves inventing explanations for behaviors initiated by other brain systems, like the right hemisphere.
That's a powerful and slightly unsettling idea, that our conscious explanations for our own behavior might sometimes be post hoc rationalizations generated by this left brain interpreter. It almost sounds a bit like Freud.
It does resonate, doesn't it? With Freud's ideas about an unconscious mind driving many of our actions and a conscious ego trying to make sense of it all, sometimes creating rationalizations, Gazzaniga's work provides a potential neurological basis for that kind of mechanism and interpreting system trying to create coherence.
Fascinating. Let's focus more specifically on language now, which we know is primarily left hemisphere dominant. What happens when those specific language areas get damaged, say by a stroke?
Damage to specific language areas in the left hemisphere leads to different types of language deficits, broadly termed aphasia. Two classic types have been studied for over a century, named after the physicians who first described them.
Okay, what are they?
First, there's Broca's aphasia, typically resulting from damage to Broca's area, located in the left frontal lobe near the motor cortex regions controlling the mouth and face.
And what does that look like?
Patients with Broca's aphasia have difficulty producing speech. Their speech is often described as labored, telegraphic, and non-fluent. They struggle to articulate words, and they tend to omit small grammatical words like is, the, and word endings. They might say something like, walk.dog instead of I will walk the dog. Comprehension is usually relatively intact for simple sentences, but they can struggle with grammatically complex ones.
So the motor programming for speech is impaired.
That's the traditional view, yes. Broca's area seems crucial for planning and executing the complex muscle movements required for fluent speech production and for handling grammar.
Yeah.
The original patient, studied by Paul Broca, nicknamed Tan, could essentially only say the word tan.
Okay, that's Broca's. What's the other main type?
The other is Wernicke's aphasia, associated with damage to Wernicke's area in the left temporal lobe near the primary auditory cortex.
And how does that differ?
Patients with Wernicke's aphasia have the opposite problem. Their speech is often perfectly fluent, grammatically correct, and well articulated. But it's often meaningless or nonsensical because they have profound difficulty understanding word meanings and finding the appropriate words to express their thoughts.
So fluent but empty speech.
Often, yes. They might use incorrect words, paraphasias, or even make up new words, neologisms. A patient might say something fluent like, you know that Smoodle Pinkard and that I want to get him round and take care of him like you want before? Which sounds okay structurally, but doesn't convey clear meaning. They also have significant trouble comprehending spoken or written language. Wernicke's area seems critical for translating sounds and symbols into meaningful concepts. So Broca's affects production and grammar, Wernicke's affects comprehension and meaning. Are these areas the only ones involved in language? That was the classic model, but modern neuroimaging studies, like PD and fMRI, while generally confirming the critical roles of Broca's and Wernicke's areas, suggest that language processing is actually much more distributed. Many other regions in the left hemisphere, and sometimes even the right hemisphere, contribute to different aspects of language. It's more like a complex, interconnected network rather than just two isolated centers.
A more complex network, which makes sense given how complex language is. Okay, from these specific functions like language, I want to shift to perhaps the most famous case study in all of neuroscience, one that dramatically illustrated the brain's role, not just in skills, but in personality itself. The story of Phineas Gage.
Ah, yes, Phineas Gage. His case, dating back to 1848, is absolutely a landmark. It's probably done more than any other single case to convince people that the brain is the physical basis of personality and decision-making.
Set the scene for us. Who was Phineas Gage before the accident?
By all accounts, before the accident, Gage was a model employee. He was a railroad construction foreman in Vermont, only 25 years old, but highly regarded by his employers. They described him as the most efficient and capable foreman in their employs, a shrewd, smart businessman possessing a well-balanced mind, temperate habits, and considered energetic and persistent in executing his plans. A reliable, well-liked guy.
A solid citizen. Then came the accident. What happened?
It was a horrific industrial accident. Gage was using a tamping iron, basically a long, pointed metal rod, to pack explosive powder into a hole drilled in rock. He got distracted for a moment, the iron struck the rock, creating a spark, and the powder exploded.
Oh, no.
The explosion drove the tamping iron, which was over 3.5 feet long, 1.25 inches in diameter, and weighed over 13 pounds upward with incredible force. It entered under his left cheekbone, passed behind his left eye, went straight through the front part of his brain, the frontal lobe, and exited out the top of his skull, landing apparently some 80 feet away.
Unbelievable that anyone could survive that.
It is truly astonishing. Even more so, Gage was reportedly conscious and talking within minutes of the accident. He was taken by ox cart to town, sat in a chair on the hotel porch waiting for the doctor, and supposedly greeted the first physician, Dr. Edward Williams, by saying something like, "Doctor, here is business enough for you." Dr. John Harlow took over his primary care and remarkably managed to prevent fatal infection, allowing Gage to physically recover.
A miraculous physical recovery. But the story doesn't end there.
Not at all. Because while Gage recovered physically, his personality underwent a radical and devastating transformation. Dr. Harlow, who knew him well both before and after, famously wrote that Gage was no longer Gage.
How had he changed?
His acquaintances reported a profound shift. The once well-balanced, reliable foreman became, in Harlow's words, fitful, irreverent, indulging at times in the grossest profanity, which was not previously his custom, manifesting but little deference for his fellows, impatient of restraint or advice when it conflicts with his desires, pertinaciously obstinate, yet capricious and vacillating, devising many plans of future operation, which are no sooner arranged than they are abandoned.
Basically, his entire character flipped.
Completely. He lost his sense of social propriety, his ability to plan and stick to goals, his respect for others. His employers, who had valued him so highly, stated the change in his mind was so marked they could not give him his old job back. He could no longer manage himself or others effectively.
What happened to him after that?
His life after the accident was difficult. He drifted through various jobs working on horse farms, briefly appearing as an exhibit at Barnum's Museum in New York with his camping iron, driving stagecoaches in Chile for several years. He eventually returned to the U.S. and died in San Francisco about 12 years after the accident, likely from epileptic seizures resulting from the brain injury at the age of just 38.
Such a tragic story. What was its broader significance for understanding the brain? Why is it such a landmark case?
Gage's case was profoundly important for several reasons. First, it demonstrated a remarkable dissociation. His intellectual abilities, his attention, perception, memory, language, basic intelligence seemed largely intact. What was selectively devastated was his personality, his character, his ability to make sound personal and social decisions.
So personality wasn't just some vague overall function, but linked to specific brain areas.
Exactly. It showed that complex aspects of personality and social conduct could be dramatically altered by damage to a specific brain region, in his case, the frontal lobes, particularly the prefrontal cortex. Before Gage, many thought the frontal lobes were relatively unimportant, maybe even silent or expendable. His case starkly revealed their crucial role in foresight, planning, judgment, social appropriateness, and the ability to make decisions conducive to one's own well-being and fit within social norms.
It linked the physical brain directly to our very sense of self and morality.
Yes. It provided compelling evidence against dualism and supported the idea that mind and personality are products of brain function. However, at the time, it also created what Harlow called the enigma of frontal lobe function. It showed that the frontal lobes were critical, but how this physical damage translated into such specific deficits in character and decision-making remained a deep mystery. It raised profound questions about the neural basis of personality, free will, and moral responsibility that scientists are still grappling with today.
From this understanding of localization, even localization of personality, it's clear the brain isn't just a fixed set of territories defined at birth. We now know it's a dynamic, ever-changing landscape. This brings us to the really incredible concept of brain plasticity, the idea that our experiences literally rewire our neural reality throughout our lives.
That's right. The brain is far from being a static, hardwired organ like a finished computer. It possesses remarkable plasticity, meaning its structure and function can change in response to experience. This happens throughout life, though it's generally more pronounced earlier on. A core principle here is often summarized as use it, it will grow, or perhaps more accurately, use it, and it will reorganize.
How is this first demonstrated?
Some of the classic early evidence came from studies comparing rats raised in enriched versus deprived environments. Rats raised in complex, stimulating cages with toys, tunnels, and other rats developed thicker cerebral cortexes, larger cortical neurons, more neurotransmitters acetylcholine, and thicker, more fully developed synapses compared to littermates raised in barren, isolated cages.
So more stimulation literally built bigger, better connected brains.
Exactly. More recent research has even shown that enriched environments can promote neurogenesis, the actual birth of new neurons, particularly in the hippocampus, a brain area crucial for learning and memory, even in adult animals. Experience can change the very number of brain cells.
That's amazing. Does this apply to learning specific skills, too?
Absolutely. There's extensive evidence for cortical reorganization during skill development. As a person or animal practices a specific skill repeatedly, the brain regions involved in that skill actually recruit ever more neurons and undergo structural changes.
Like the sensory maps we talked about.
Precisely. For example, researchers trained monkeys to discriminate between different vibration frequencies applied to one specific finger. After weeks of practice, the area of the somatosensory cortex representing that trained finger had significantly enlarged compared to the areas for adjacent, untrained fingers.
Does this happen in humans?
Yes, definitely. Studies on musicians who play stringed instruments, like violinists or cellists, show they have larger representations in their somatosensory cortex for the fingers of their left hand, the hand doing the complex fingerwork on the strings, compared to non-musicians, or even compared to their own right hand.
Wow.
Similarly, blind individuals who read Braille show increased cortical activity and sometimes enlarged cortical representation for their primary reading finger. And in cases of sensory loss, plasticity can be even more dramatic.
How so?
There's evidence for cross-modal plasticity. For instance, in people who've been blind from an early age, parts of the occipital cortex, which normally process vision, can be repurposed or taken over to process information from other senses, like touch for Braille reading or hearing for localizing sounds.
Yes.
It shows the brain's remarkable ability to adapt its resources based on experience and need.
So the visual cortex can learn to hear or feel.
In a functional sense, yes, it gets recruited into those networks. Another really compelling line of evidence for experience-driven structural change comes from studies on spatial learning and the hippocampus.
You mentioned the hippocampus is involved in spatial navigation.
Yes. Studies in birds that hide thousands of seeds over a large area and need to remember their locations later. These species tend to have significantly larger hippocampi compared to related bird species that don't hoard food. Even more strikingly, in some species, the hippocampus actually grows larger during the seasons when they're actively hiding and retrieving seeds, and then shrinks again afterwards.
Experience directly changing brain volume. Is there human evidence for this?
There is, and it's quite famous. The studies of London taxi drivers. To get licensed in London, cab drivers have to pass an incredibly demanding test called the Knowledge, which requires them to memorize the layout of thousands of streets, landmarks, and complex routes within the city. It takes years of intensive training.
I've heard about that. It sounds incredibly difficult.
It is. And researchers found that licensed London taxi drivers have significantly larger posterior hippocampi, the part of the hippocampus most strongly associated with spatial memory compared to control subjects, like bus drivers who drive fixed routes. Furthermore, the longer an individual had been working as a taxi driver, the larger their posterior hippocampus tended to be.
So years of navigating London physically grew that part of their brain.
That's the strong implication. It's powerful evidence in humans that extensive spatial learning and experience can lead to measurable changes in the structure of brain regions involved in that skill.
This is incredible. What's happening at the cellular level to allow for this kind of learning and rewiring? How do connections actually change?
The cellular basis for learning and memory is thought to involve changes in the strength of synaptic connections between neurons. A key theoretical idea here, proposed back in 1949 by Donald Hebb, is often summarized as neurons that fire together wire together.
Hebb's rule. What does it mean?
It means that if a presynaptic neuron, or the sending neuron, repeatedly or persistently takes part in firing a postsynaptic neuron, the receiving neuron, then the connection between them gets strengthened. The synapse becomes more efficient, making it easier for the first neuron to excite the second one in the future.
So activity strengthens the pathway.
Exactly. This provides a plausible mechanism for how associations are learned, and memories are formed by strengthening the specific neural pathways that are active during an experience. Physiologically, a process called long-term potentiation, LTP, is widely studied as a likely mechanism underlying Hebbian learning. LTP involves long-lasting increases in synaptic effectiveness following high-frequency stimulation. It's considered a fundamental cellular basis for learning and memory formation in many brain areas, especially the hippocampus. Our experiences are literally, physically rewriting the connections in our brains, strengthening some, perhaps weakening others, constantly shaping the neural landscape.
We've journeyed an incredible distance today, from the earliest philosophical debates about mind and body, through the intricate dance of neurons and neurotransmitters, exploring the specialized functions of different brain regions, the dramatic impact of brain damage like Phineas Gage's, and finally to the astonishing ways our everyday experiences constantly reshape our neural landscape through plasticity. It's truly mind-opening.
It really is a fascinating journey, revealing the brain as this incredibly complex, dynamic, biological machine that somehow generates our entire subjective world.
But despite all this incredible scientific progress, mapping the where, and even beginning to understand the how of brain function, there's still a profound, almost magical question that seems to remain at the heart of it all, isn't there?
That's absolutely right. Even with all our sophisticated tools and detailed knowledge, we arrive back at what philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness.
The hard problem. What exactly is that?
The easy problems, relatively speaking, are about explaining the functions, how the brain processes information, integrates sensory input, controls behavior, discriminates, reports mental states. We're making progress on those. The hard problem, famously articulated by philosopher David Chalmers, is about explaining why and how all this physical processing gives rise to subjective experience, the qualitative feeling, the what it's like aspect of consciousness.
Why does it feel like something to see red or feel pain or fall in love?
Exactly. Why isn't all this complex information processing just happening in the dark without any accompanying inner subjective life? T.H. Huxley, Darwin's contemporary, captured this enduring mystery beautifully. He wrote, "How it is that anything so remarkable as a state of consciousness comes about as a result of irritating nervous tissue is just as unaccountable as the appearance of the jinn when Aladdin rubs his lamp."
There's still that sense of magic, that profound explanatory gap between physical processes and subjective feeling.
There is. We can trace the neural pathways involved in seeing red, but that doesn't seem to fully explain the experience of redness itself. This leads us to what's often called a mechanistic conception of mental life, the view arising from neuroscience that our thoughts, feelings, decisions, our very sense of self are ultimately the products of neurochemical and physical processes in the brain.
And that mechanistic view, while scientifically powerful, can create some real tension, can't it? Especially with deeply held humanist values.
It absolutely can. If all our actions, choices, and feelings are ultimately traceable to deterministic or probabilistic neurobiological events, what does that mean for cherished concepts like free will and moral responsibility? If my choice was just the inevitable outcome of prior brain states and inputs, was it truly my choice in the way we usually mean?
Right. If it's all just neurons firing, where does responsibility lie?
That's a huge ongoing debate. Similarly, does a purely mechanistic view potentially diminish the intrinsic value or dignity we attribute to a person? If love is just oxytocin and dopamine, does that devalue the experience? And how does this scientific perspective reconcile with spiritual beliefs about an immaterial soul or spirit that many people hold?
These are profound challenges that science raises for our traditional understanding of ourselves.
They really are. And when individuals are confronted with this tension between the scientific conception of the mind and these deeply rooted humanist or spiritual values, they often find themselves facing, broadly speaking, three fundamental options.
What are those options?
Well, one option is to simply reject the scientific conception of the mind. One might embrace traditional dualism, perhaps on religious or philosophical grounds, and argue that scientific psychology, while useful for understanding reflexes or basic processing, simply cannot capture the essence of the human mind or soul.
Okay, reject the science. What's the opposite?
The second, opposite option is to fully embrace the scientific conception and reject the traditional humanist values that seem incompatible with it. From this perspective, concepts like free will, intrinsic moral worth, or an immaterial soul might be seen as useful illusions, pre-scientific ideas that we should discard in light of modern knowledge. We are sophisticated biological machines, and that's the whole story.
That sounds rather stark for many people. Is there a third way?
The third option, and perhaps the one many scientists and philosophers grapple with most, is to try and reconcile these seemingly disparate views. This involves attempting to integrate the scientific understanding of the brain and mind with cherished humanist values. Can we find ways to understand free will, responsibility, meaning, and value within a scientific physicalist framework? Can we see the astonishing complexity and capabilities of the brain not as diminishing human worth, but as the very source of it?
Finding a way for science and human values to coexist or even enrich each other.
Exactly. But how to do that successfully is far from settled. It remains an ongoing, profound debate, a challenge that shapes not just neuroscience and philosophy, but our very understanding of ourselves, our societies, and our place in the cosmos.
This has been an absolutely incredible deep dive. Seriously illuminating. We've journeyed from ancient philosophy to the cutting edge of brain science, uncovering so much about the astonishing biological machinery that creates the experience of being you. It really offers a new lens, doesn't it, through which to view our everyday experiences and our very sense of self. Thank you so much for guiding us through this profound and complex territory.
It's been my genuine pleasure. It's a topic that touches the core of who we are. And perhaps, as we reflect on the brain's incredible plasticity, its constant reshaping by every thought and experience, I can leave you, our listener, with one final thought to ponder.
Please do.
If Francis Crick was right, if you are indeed no more, but also no less, than a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules, and if, as we've seen, that assembly is constantly being rewired by your experiences, then what responsibility do you hold for actively shaping that very assembly, for shaping yourself through the experiences you seek out, the knowledge you pursue, the relationships you cultivate, and the thoughts you choose to dwell on?